So I'm very pleased to be here and to introduce this panel of what I think are really some of the leading thought leaders on Cuba, on U.S. Cuba policy. Two have very distinguished careers, perhaps longer than we all care to admit, as experts in Latin America and especially on Cuba, and somebody who is a leading expert on Cuba because one of the very important positions she held in the administration put her in a place to negotiate with the Cuban government and help to shape U.S. policy towards Cuba while she was in office. To my immediate left is Julissa Sweig, who is a senior research fellow at the Lyndon Johnson School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas, but she spent many years at the Council on Foreign Relations, really one of the leading authorities on Latin America and Cuba. To her left is Ted Piccone, who is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution with the Project on International Order and Strategy and the Latin America Initiative. And then we have Julissa Reynoso, currently a partner at Chadbourne and Parke here in New York, was most recently ambassador of the United States in Uruguay, and was also the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central America, the Caribbean, and Cuba. I always loved when she told her title that she distinguished the Caribbean from Cuba, and I think I asked her once, why do you do that? And I'm Cuban American. She said, because you guys take up so much of my time, we have to have a separate, I have to take them out of the Caribbean so I can treat them separately. Anyway, welcome to all of you. Julie, let me begin with you. There is I understand there is a story, probably a joke, being told in Cuba that around the time of the rupture of relations between the United States and Cuba, that Fidel Castro was having a conversation with Ernesto Guevara, and Guevara was asking Fidel, now that this happened, when do you think the United States and Cuba will be friends again? And supposedly Fidel, without missing a beat, said, Che, that's going to happen when the United States has a black president and when the Pope is Argentine like you. So, in any event. This, I think, is a reminder that, and we don't want to dwell too much in the past, but it's a reminder of how the United States and Cuba broke relations well over 50 years ago, and how in so many ways our dialogue or lack thereof has really characterized that relationship until the announcement of December 17th. And of course, now that we know that there were negotiations going on for 18 months prior to that. Julia, let me begin with you. It's been a long time. At the same time, however, we know now that there have been times during the last 50 years when other presidents, there's no question that what the president did is unprecedented, but there have been other presidents that have made attempts. Why did they fail, do you think? And what is it about this period that allowed these two presidents to come together and at least try to give it another try and do it in such a public way?
Well, Gustavo, I will try to be succinct with my answer. He just asked me to summarize 55 years, so I apologize if I go on, but I won't too much. But first, congratulations to you and to Susan and to the Wharton clan for making this happen, and it's great to see so many familiar faces and old friends here, so I'm very happy to be here with you all. The essence of the answer is that this time is different, and I'll talk about why that is, but that the repeated attempts at dialogue, secret dialogue, over the years has been memorialized in a fantastic book published last year called Back Channel to Cuba. So read the book for the long answer. But the short answer has to do with Cold War legacy. The context of the Cold War made it very, very tough. The United States and Cuba seldom had their interests aligned in terms of geopolitics. In terms of ideology, they never had their interests aligned after 1959. And in terms of personality, we also, and I think here personality really does matter, we're at a moment where the specific cast of characters, the actual actors that put this together, really make a difference. So Pope Francisco and the Vatican and the Catholic Church and Archbishop Jaime Ortega in Havana had been talking for some time about the Latin America context of this, and Francisco naturally, as a Latin American, understood the important symbolic value of getting the Cuba piece of the dialogue in the Americas back on track. He had also been in extended dialogue with the Catholic community in Cuba and with Ortega specifically for years, watching as the Catholic Church built greater and greater space for itself on the island, and backed the notion that an approach of reconciliation as opposed to oppositional politics with the Cuban government would be the best path forward for the church and for the Cuban people. In the Senate, Senator Patrick Leahy has ties to the Catholic Church, but I don't want to overdraw the Catholic element of it, simply that beginning in 2013, Senator Leahy and Raul Castro started a dialogue themselves, and they were able to get to a common understanding of how, as they put it, to leave the relationship in better shape for their grandchildren. So you have people who have been working on this longer than we have, who are now looking toward their legacy. That includes Raul Castro, and it certainly includes Barack Obama. Raul Castro's external calculus requires that the relationship with the United States become more natural, if not normal, that the ties between the two countries that are organic between people and markets and history have an opportunity to flourish. And Barack Obama, and I'm accelerating here, second-term president, clearly has a foreign policy opportunity in Latin America as a whole through the Cuban door. We'll see if that works out. And ideology and demographics have also driven this in both countries as well. So we have a moment where the alignment between the two presidents and two countries is probably closer than it's ever been since the 1959 alleged joke between Fidel and Che.
Ted, the United States, can you hear me? Is this not working?
Yeah.
The United States, throughout the many years, has cited a number of reasons for initially justifying the rupture, expropriation of properties, of course, bringing the Soviet Union, our arch enemy, in the 50s, 60s, into the relationship, into our hemisphere. The Cubans sending troops into Africa. A lot of those reasons, of course, have gone by the wayside. Cuba, to the best I understand, is no longer, quote-unquote, exporting revolution into Latin America, at least not violent overthrows, the overthrowing of governments. Bring us up to date. What are the issues on the table today?
Sure. I mean, we do have to keep in mind we have the toughest, most comprehensive embargo against this small country as a neighbor. It's unusual, and so it's a good question to ask. And the rationale, of course, has changed over time. The Cold War ended some time ago, but U.S. policy didn't really reflect that change. But some new arguments were put on the table, particularly after the Soviet Union departed, and there was a strong sentiment within the Congress in particular, Democrats and Republicans, who felt that now is the time to really tighten the screws on Cuba, that they were going through this special period, this crisis of a collapse of their economy, the withdrawal of Soviet support, and what we wanted to do really was to force the ultimate collapse of the Cuban regime. And so we took an even harder turn in the way we approached Cuba, including by codifying this embargo, which up to that time had been through executive action, which really forced us into a corner and limited our options, as we've seen play out over all these years. A critical moment, of course, was in 1996, when after a lot of communications that were misread, perhaps, there was an incident, a shoot down of a plane carrying Cuban exiles who were dropping leaflets on the island, a dispute over whether they were in Cuban or international airspace, but the plane was shot down and 4 people were killed. And this was really the critical moment in which the tipping point went toward locking in this embargo. Since then, of course, a lot has happened, a lot has changed. Cuba has turned to Venezuela as its main benefactor, and the United States has enforced this embargo in some very strict ways and has really punished companies, including under the Obama administration. We have to be honest about that. In the last several years, heavy fines against banks in particular. And this is in part because Cuba is on the state sponsors of terrorism list. And that's an immediate red flag for any bank in particular to say, whoa, we can't do business with this. And then a number of them got caught up in this enforcement world. But Cuba, in the meantime, has opened itself to engagement, particularly economic engagement, with the rest of the world. And new players have come into the scene, particularly China. Brazil is also a very important player. Cuba is trying to diversify its relations, so it's not so dependent on Venezuela, and it's had some success. And so when you look at it from that perspective, they needed to diversify, including towards the United States, a natural, if not partner, relationship for them to have. And I agree with Julia, maybe never quite normal. There's nothing normal about the U.S.-Cuba relationship, but maybe more stable in the future. So it's really time for us to catch up and update our policies. The embargo in the end only isolated the United States, and we know that because every year the UN General Assembly passes a resolution in which the United States and Israel and maybe Micronesia vote. Everyone else votes against the embargo. And so that's just one symbolic example of how we were losing any kind of influence while other countries were engaging in productive ways.
Ted, there's a lot of the focus has been on the United States refusing to engage in a serious dialogue, discussion with the Cubans. But there's a theory that's been out there for a while that, in fact, it's the Cuban government that has resisted a dialogue, that the Cuban government has benefited by maintaining and promoting this idea of a David against Goliath in order to ensure that it's able to carry on its domestic policies as they wish. What do you make of that theory? Is it too cynical? Is it? I mean, what do you think?
Well, I think it's more than theory, but I think it's out of date. I think Raul Castro is not Fidel Castro, and I think we have to recognize that. This is a much more pragmatic leader who is trying to institutionalize some of the key achievements of the revolution in a way that's sustainable, and to do that needs to engage with the United States. And I think the David Goliath analogy is still apt. I think it works not only in building up international sympathy, and by the way, that was an important factor in moving the president toward this decision, because the president was looking ahead to the Summit of the Americas next week in Panama, and the other countries in the region said, we're not coming to the summit unless Cuba is invited. And even though Cuba technically did not meet the democratic criteria of the summit. And so, the United States faced the choice. Are we going to have this forum for dialogue with all the other countries of the region or not? And so that's one example of the international pressure and the David versus Goliath sympathy that Cuba used very effectively internationally. But it also works for them at home politically, and this has been used to create a lot of support for the regime and their approach to a much more closed system. And I think what we're going to see now is a breakdown of that approach and a much more open set of relationships. Okay.
Ambassador Reynoso.
Julissa, to you.
I was present in Miami on May 23rd, 2008, when then Senator Obama talked about his vision for the region and specifically on Cuba. He spoke before a very large crowd of the Cuban American National Foundation and talked about how it was important to increase travel, family travel, and also remittances. And certainly he did that in the first few months in office. You were in the State Department. You were a senior person helping to shape policy towards Cuba. You are perhaps the only person attending this conference who had direct knowledge and activity having to do with U.S. policy towards Cuba, and hopefully can actually talk about it. Bring us back to those early days of the Obama administration. what was going through the minds of the administration, State Department, in terms of Cuba policy? But also, obviously, as the State Department normally does, you have outreach and engagement with different stakeholders. Without necessarily naming any names, what were those stakeholders telling you? What was going through your minds when you were, of course, at the State Department, thinking about all the different areas of engagement in the United States and the conflicts, of course, Iraq, Afghanistan were going on. But what was the thinking on Cuba at that time?
Well, when I joined the State Department in 2009, we had there was a lot of interest in Cuba and trying to focus our energies in a creative manner to try to come up with new ways of engaging Cuban people and the Cuban government. Okay. That's a very broad principle. But within that scope, there were a lot of folks, both in the State Department and other agencies in the White House as well, who were very keen to be much more thoughtful about how we dealt with our Cuba situation. We thought, and there's evidence, obviously, that a lot of our practices had not been very effective. And we thought that given there was a regional dynamic that was pressing us to do something about our Cuba relationship. There were countless leaders from Latin America and the Caribbean that raised Cuba as a problem for us vis-a-vis the relationship with them. And we also thought that there were new tools for engagement that allowed us to be principled and at the same time help the Cuban people move forward in a way that we thought was productive and useful for them, both economically and in terms of their own democratic and social rights. In the context of in context of that scenario, we also thought it was useful to engage the Cuban government in a respectful manner, presenting our points of differences and discord, while at the same time giving them the deference to have a dialogue at different levels on migration talks, postal services, to higher level political engagement, so that we can try to come to some form of meeting of the minds about how we can improve the bilateral relationship for everyone's benefit.
Let me see if I can ask the stakeholder question a different way. For many years, at least from the beginning of the 1970s.
I'm still a diplomat.
Clearly.
And hopefully you will be again. The United States has been accused of not having a foreign policy towards Cuba, but rather having a electoral political, South Florida-based policy towards Cuba. To what extent did you feel that was the case? To what extent did the administration try to reach out to the Cuban American community to have a sense of where things stood? Clearly there have been some evolution and demographic changes. To what extent, I guess, perhaps it's a bit of a crass question, but I think it's one that I think it's been such a driver for policy for so many years. To what extent did domestic politics play into the design of the policy?
It was relevant. We had ongoing conversations with Cuban Americans of all thought, from folks that were very critical of any type of engagement with the Cuban government, and I had numerous groups of individuals come through my office when I was there, and also we went to Miami several times and heard it firsthand to folks like yourself and other Cuban Americans here who were pushing us to do more. So we heard it from both sides. Obviously, there's also an important constituency in Congress that we also heard it from, that's much more critical of any, or critical, not even more, just critical of moving forward with any form of relationship or engagement or improvement in the relationship with Cuba as they see it. So that was also an important stakeholder group. So you had many in Cuba. You have a lot of stakeholders, probably more than any other country that I have had to deal with. You had the Cuban Americans, both pro and con. You had think tanks, mostly pro. You had members of Congress, mostly against, although you had some important actors like Senator Leahy that wanted more engagement and others like him. And then you have the entire gamut of Latin American and Caribbean leaders and others, including Europeans, that were pressing us to do more and in a much more elaborate and much more organized way, and so it was all over the map in terms of the feedback we were getting from people on this particular policy. And of course, you have the Cuban government. That's also obviously an important stakeholder, which bilaterally is the main player that we've had to deal with.
Okay. So, Julia, let's go back to the beginning of the administration. You wrote what I thought was a fascinating piece. It was an open letter to President Obama in Cigar Aficionado magazine.
Very important scholarly journal.
I confess I read that piece after December 17th.
Oh.
And I have to tell you, I thought, wow, here it is, right? I mean, in a sense, you were saying, treat Cuba like any other country, for better or for worse. Tell us about that one of the most important articles in the history of that magazine. What was your thinking, and what's the theory behind that? Okay.
Well, that magazine gets credit because Cigar Aficionado, actually on the weekend after December 17th, I think the publisher of Cigar Aficionado ran a reproduction of the 10 covers of the issue that had dealt with Cuba over the previous 20 years. They'd run interviews with Fidel and, Cigar. He stopped smoking cigars before he did the interview for Cigar Aficionado. But in any case, it does have an established reputation on the issue of the relationship. And it was published and distributed all over Washington the weekend of the president's first inauguration by a matter of strategy. So what it basically argued was that the president should do what he just did. And the argument was based on national interest. This is a policy that's failed. The United States and Cuba have what President McKinley, probably the last president to talk about Cuba in a State of the Union address before President Obama, described as ties of singular intimacy of geography and economy and people and history, and that it was time to move on, and that the policy had failed, and that the elements of it that were kind of the biggest stumbling blocks, which had to do with the perception that the Cuban American community was this inviolable monolith that could not be challenged, was in fact a myth, and I tried to debunk that myth. That the notion that promoting democracy through USAID programs, that democracy promotion had become regime change and had turned our interest section, soon to be embassy, into an institution that was, in fact, farther and farther isolated from the Cuban people by virtue of those programs, that those needed to be reformed, that Cuba's presence on the terrorist list was made a mockery of our own counterterrorism efforts globally, and that in Latin America, this president stood to seize for himself a major legacy opportunity by actually doing something with Cuba that now is the best time to do. And finally, that Cuba itself is changing, that the dynamic on the ground really, and this was in 2009 when I wrote that the reform process under Raul Castro would be inexorable. And I think there's lots of evidence that you're going to hear today of that fact. A year later, if I can just tell you a quick little anecdote. In 2010, I spent the better part of a week with Fidel Castro because I accompanied the Atlantic journalist Jeff Goldberg down for a series of interviews purportedly about the Middle East and Iran and anti-Semitism and Israel, and we talked about all of that. But over lunch, this is a Fidel Castro who was clearly not in power, long time kibitzing over lunch, not lecturing, schmoozing, and I'm not a journalist, so I fumbled a question that I wanted to ask him about how he felt about having his children and grandchildren in Latin America running various countries, that this was his strategy of decades now played out. And Goldberg said, what she's trying to ask you is, are you still going to export the Cuban model? And that wasn't what I was trying to ask, but in any case, the answer was, the Cuban model, it doesn't even work for us anymore. And that, was patently evident on the ground. It was the coin of the realm, what everybody was discussing, but it precipitated, Raul Castro the next month announced that they were going to be cutting state budgets and cutting the state payroll, and that this redefinition of the social contract that's deepened dramatically since 2010 is the real deal. So that was the last piece of the argument in the memo to the president.
Ted, critics of the policy have said the United States gave up too much, and we got real little in return. How do you answer those critics? And then maybe also, just because we only have 10 minutes left, follow-up question is, hear the argument that given what's happening with Venezuela, and Venezuela being such an important benefactor, this is not the time to throw in a lifeline to the Cuban government.
Right, and we've heard that argument many times before. Just wait him out, Castro will die, and then we'll all walk in and, restore Cuba to what it used to be or what it could be, which is just a myth. I mean, Cuba and the Castros have survived how many, 10 presidents? And so I think it was really time to move on. I think your first question, remind me what the...
In terms of the... I forgot my own first question.
You've answered the follow-up.
Oh, give it too much.
Yeah,
so Stefan Selig, I thought, answered this quite well, that this was not a matter of a negotiated deal, that this was a strategic opening that put us on a new path. And but we do have to recognize that there was a very important breakthrough that got us to that point. We needed certain things, and critical to that was a return of Alan Gross, who was a USAID contractor who was arrested in jail for 5 years to doing democracy programming and other things. You would call it in different ways. And of course, the Cubans wanted the return of some of their agents to Cuba. And once they figured out a way through that problem, it was kind of unleashing all the next steps. And it took 18 months of secret negotiations, and that piece of it did not fall into place until pretty close to the end. In terms of the human rights components, I mean, there were political prisoners released, over 50, and I think that is not often recognized, and that's important. But as I think Roberta or someone else recognized, there are ongoing problems and repression of activists, and that's a concern, and it should be a concern for our government. But the real opportunity is what's in our interest, I think. The United States should be engaging with Cuba, a neighbor. There's much more upside opportunity than downside, that a policy for 50 years of isolation and punishment was not only not working, it was counterproductive to our own goals.
And Ted, you mentioned human rights, obviously an important issue for the United States, has been for many years. But how do you place that in the context of the kinds of dialogues we have with other countries around the world, which I think goes back to Julia's idea of treating everyone equally, at least all countries think about it in the same way. And if there are concerns about human rights, clearly we have a dialogue with them about that.
Yeah.
But is Cuba special in that regard when it comes to human rights?
I mean, I think when we do have human rights problems with lots of other countries in the world, and we do more than dialoguing about it. We actually do have human rights-related sanctions, as witnessed the most recent decision on Venezuela. Those are human rights-related sanctions. But instead of a comprehensive embargo which punishes the entire Cuban population, there's a move toward much more targeted types of sanctions, where you try to identify the specific individuals and say, you can't come into our country, you can't use our financial system, which sounds to me like a much more reasonable way of addressing the problem. And I think at the end of the day, the human rights problem has to be solved by Cubans in Cuba. And already we have seen some progress. we talk about how Cuba's changed under Raul Castro, the ability to open businesses, to buy and sell your property, to own cell phones, and to leave the island, most importantly, and return. I think that's an important right that Cubans now have that they didn't have before, and that, by the way, a lot of Americans don't have in their own ability and freedom to travel to Cuba. So I think we have to have a really honest dialogue about what we mean by human rights, including the whole issue of economic and social rights. I mean, the Cuban government is very proud of what they've been able to deliver to their people in that context. We don't talk about economic and social rights in this country in the same way, but there are international norms and universal norms that should be addressed. I think the smokescreen about the Cubans use, this is interference in our internal affairs, is a problem because these are universal norms that have been signed up to, and they need to be held accountable to them, just like every other country should be.
Let me ask the final question of the panel, and then hopefully we'll have time for one or two questions. Julissa, as an ambassador, one of the issues I understand is the scope of activities that's being negotiated in connection with the opening of embassies, the scope of activities allowed to U.S. diplomats. How, and of course, negotiated under the Vienna Convention, as a chief of mission or country, how important is it to be able to have outreach to the population in general?
Yeah. Mind you, it's bilateral, right? So the Cubans also are seeking the same type of access.
Of course.
We have restrictions in terms of literally geographic travel rights for Cubans here, and we have the same in Havana. As a former ambassador, it's incredibly important for the ambassador to be able to speak to anyone within the scope of promoting the bilateral relationship, right? So that goes from the president, forum, and the ministers to the business community and the civil society. And I think that's something that is ongoing in terms of the dialogue with the Cuban government right now. Mind you, in Cuba, we have a large mission. Although we officially don't have a U.S. embassy, we have a very important presence in Cuba. The U.S. government does. So it's just because we don't have an embassy does not mean that we don't have activity and a whole lot of contact with a whole lot of players, from very senior members of the government to folks from civil society. So that is already in place and has been ongoing. It's different to different degrees depending on who's in charge of the embassy and the relationship we have with the Cuban government. But the goal is to try to make that relationship and that access for both countries and both governments and both embassies and missions as normal as possible, so there can be free movement and access to different sectors.
I want to thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions. I hope and invite the three of you to stay for lunch and perhaps the reception if you don't have to get back to Washington, which we probably do, and hopefully you can engage them that way. But thank you again, Julia, Ted, and the ambassador for being with us today.
Thank you, Gustavo.